Now, how do you even see this, right? Like you said, this is thousands of meters down. Like Mid-Atlantic Ridge is not a shallow area of the ocean. So how do you even go down and like see what's happening?
We rely on a lot of technology. I mean, the whole plate tectonic theory is built on a history of research cruises that become progressively more and more technologically advanced. Like some of the first sort of inferences that there was even a mid-Atlantic ridge were in like the 1850s, and they were mostly by naval ships that were just sort of, looking at how deep the ocean was in a straight line. But now we have much more technology. So we use a combination of geophysical techniques and also robots and sometimes submarines. I've never been in a submarine, but some people do still use them. And we go out usually with a research vessel, so on a big ship. And there'll be a whole variety of people there, from the crew that run the ship to the science party who are obsessed with collecting rocks, whatever else they're interested in. We usually have something that's quite nice about it is because deploying this infrastructure is quite expensive. Usually you get quite a nice diversity of people working together. So people that are interested in all the different aspects of the science will go. So you'll have geologists, you'll have seismologists, you'll have geochemists, you'll have biologists, oceanographers, all sorts. So you learn a lot, which is really nice. And then we'll also usually have like a big sort of selection of technical people that run our equipment. So one of the first things we tend to do is to map the seafloor. Mapping the seafloor is such a hard thing to do, and it's so expensive, and the oceans are so big. And there are a lot of different programs now that are aimed at just mapping what the seafloor looks like, even at sort of 150-meter resolution. You often hear that we know more about planets than we do about the bottom of the ocean, and that's not entirely true. But in terms of its actual shape, that's probably the case because we can't see through water with satellites. So we have to run ships or other kinds of vessels over the sea to image what the seafloor actually looks like.
All right. This is using like side scan sonar or something similar?
Yeah, so we use side scan as one of the things. So that's where you have sound that looks out to either side and it looks at how bright the reflection of the seafloor is. Primarily, we use something called multi-beam bathymetry, and that involves bouncing sound off the seafloor and then recording how long it takes to come back. And then from that, you can map out sort of in a line across the ship, sort of a series of points of depth. And from that, you do it repeatedly. So you ping as you move the ship along, and using those, all of those different dots, eventually, if you do a survey pattern, you can create a map of what the seafloor looks like. And then if you wanted to go up a step in resolution, so once you've produced this map, maybe at 50 meters, say for a few thousand meters of water, that would be a typical resolution that you get. Then you've got to start using other technology to get better resolution than that. So we use things called autonomous underwater vehicles. These are like torpedoes, but without any kind of military application. So they look like big yellow torpedoes, but inside them they have all of their scientific equipment. So they often will contain a multi-beam, but because they can go underneath the sea and survey, we can get much closer to the seafloor, which means we can improve the resolution. So if you were doing multi-beam with an autonomous underwater vehicle, instead of getting 50 meters resolution from the top of the sea, you'd get within sort of 100 meters of the bottom and get 2-meter resolution, which is a massive improvement. So that really, really helps with the mapping side. And then we also run other sensors on those. So we might look at like how hard the seafloor is. So using side scan sonar, that can be really helpful for mapping out sedimentary environments, or looking at where different type biological organisms might live, mapping out all of those different things. So sediment sizes and types, and where rocks are and where cliffs are. Side scan is also often used in archaeological type searches, or searches for things that have been lost at sea, because it has quite a big coverage. So that's useful. We collect geochemical measurements using a number of different instruments and sampling as well. And then if we want to really look at the seafloor, we can either use cameras, so we can mount cameras on autonomous vehicles, or we use remotely operated vehicles, which are usually called ROVs. And you quite often see those in documentaries being used. They were used a lot for sort of imagery for things like Blue Planet. And those are robots that are operated from the surface. So an autonomous vehicle we program and then we send it off and it runs on its own. Whereas an ROV we have on a cable and we send it down to the bottom, and it has all of these high resolution video cameras on it. It has sampling equipment. It'll have a really bespoke array of different sensors and equipment on it, depending on what the objective is. But we can use those to physically sample the seafloor, so to pick things up, to take video transects, to work out what's living where, to survey corals, that kind of thing. There's some really incredible footage that's been captured sort of serendipitously of an active volcanic eruption under the sea by an ROV. And then they can also do things like sample hydrothermal fluids. So the circulation of fluids in oceanic crust is a really important process, both for the development of the crust itself, but also for deep sea life. These are really important environments. And so we can do sampling of those environments. We can reconstruct them using the imagery in very, very high resolution. So you can do something called photogrammetry, which is where you use video or photographic data to reconstruct like sub-centimeter resolution 3D models. And then they can sample the fluids and the biology and the mineralization and all of those different things with robots. And then they bring it all back to the top. We put it all back on the ship, then we go home. And then you usually spend, it'll be a team of tens of people will usually spend years analysing the data just from one expedition. So it's quite an undertaking, but yeah, pretty good. And then we have other geophysical methods as well. So things like seismic studies, where you use different frequencies of sound to look beneath the surface, electromagnetics, which can tell us about porosity and permeability of the seafloor, and loads of other techniques. There are new ones being developed all the time.
So fascinating. So how long are these cruises? Like a couple of weeks, and then you spend years analyzing the data?
Yeah, they can be. They're variable, so it will depend on how far away you're going and what you're doing while you're there. And also, often it depends on the logistical sort of requirements of the ship. So different vessels have different endurances, so different amounts of time that they can be at sea. And so if you wanted to go for several months, you need to be on quite a big ship, because otherwise it can't carry enough water or food or enough crew to support that. Typically, the research expeditions I go on are between about 4 and 6 weeks, but I've done longer ones and I've done shorter ones. There are some expeditions that do scientific drilling of the seafloor, so they drill boreholes to look at the subsurface geology and biology as well. And those can be 2 months, but they're even longer because it's a big vessel and it takes a long time.
Yeah, to drill those holes.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you take core samples during your sampling?
Yeah, we do. So again, it depends on what the objectives are. So sometimes you really need that subsurface information to answer a question, and sometimes you don't. We've done quite a lot of subsurface drilling using sort of seabed drill rigs instead of drilling from the ship. Like traditionally, when you think about drilling the seabed, you think about, I suppose, oil and gas type drilling, where you have like a ship that with a big derrick on it that drills from the sea surface right through to the ocean floor. We tend not to use those mainly because they're extremely expensive. But IODP, the Integrated Ocean Discovery Programme, do that. But for my work, we tend to use smaller drills, so things that we sort of deploy over the side of the vessel, and then they land on the seafloor, and then they drill from there. We also have a little tiny drill for sampling of shallow cores that we run off the ROV. It's quite effective as well. And that information can be really, really useful, because if you're just relying on picking things up off the surface, they're often quite sort of altered or old. You're only looking at one dimension, I suppose. And really, if you're looking at something that I'm interested in, which is the construction of ocean crust, the 3D dimension is really important. You want to know what lies beneath the surface as well. So those they're hard to run. Logistically, it's extremely difficult to run something that technologically complicated in thousands of meters of water at high pressure, at cold temperatures, in the dark. It's really logistically difficult, but it's really, really, really useful. So if you get one core, that is an invaluable record of what's happened in that area for a really long period.
It's essentially a time capsule, right?
Exactly, yeah. And for those, you'll have, tens of people that will work on those for tens of years.
That's amazing. I actually just saw an article the other day that they drilled the largest core sample ever in the Atlantic, and maybe in all the oceans. It was like 38 feet long.
Yeah, I can believe that. So I was on an expedition just a few weeks ago with a seabed rock drill, and we drilled, I think it's one of the deepest cores that's ever been drilled at that water depth. It was 20 meters. So yeah, it's not super long.
It's crazy. It's crazy to think about.
And it's a big team that it takes to do that as well. So one of those bits of equipment, you will maybe have a team of 8 or 9 people just running that. So if you only have like 30 berths available on your ship, then it's a big undertaking to take that many people. You're cutting down on the other activities you can do. But then those records are so useful that I think it's really worth doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So wait, you said your core sample was 20 meters long?
Yeah, I'm working in metric, not in feet.
I know, but that's like 60 feet. So that would make this article inaccurate. Were you in the Atlantic?
We were in the Atlantic, yeah. But I mean...
Oh, almost double.
I don't know the statistics, so I can't say that it was definitely the longest. It's the longest we've ever drilled in the Atlantic. But I mean, there were holes drilled by IODP again, so this like Integrated Ocean Discovery Program that are longer.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was the deepest. It wasn't the longest.
Yeah, I could believe that.
Okay. They recently collected a 38-foot-long cylindrical sediment sample from the deepest part of the Puerto Rico Trench, nearly 5 miles below the surface.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because yeah, like you do get much longer cores. They've cored hundreds, even thousands of meters with IODP in different areas, but they're really sort of spread out. So because it's so expensive and it takes such a long time, there aren't many of those cores available.
Primarily, your work is in the Atlantic, correct? But you've surveyed in the Pacific Ocean as well, I was reading.
Yeah, so I started off working basically only in the Atlantic, but I diversified into quite a lot of different processes. I became really interested in the interaction of volcanic systems and the ocean. So, in terms of both how water is important in volcanic eruptions, but also how hydrothermal circulation in volcanoes influences how they erupt and what products they produce. And so I started working not just on mid-ocean ridge volcanoes, but also on those produced subduction zones, so where one of the plates is being pushed underneath another. And there you tend to get more explosive volcanic eruptions. So, for example, the recent Hunga Tonga Hunga Harpai eruption, I work quite a lot in that region in Tonga in the South Pacific. So I work there quite a lot because there's some really interesting volcano ocean dynamics going on in that region, and a real variety of different types of volcano there as well. And then I've also worked all over the place. Yeah, right across the Atlantic. I've worked on the Juan de Fuca Ridge, and some of the other ridges in the Pacific as well, and then up towards the Arctic as well. So north of Iceland is another area that I've done quite a bit of work. And that's really beautiful up there, I recommend. Polar regions, they're stunning.